This is my true story. I worked my whole life so my son could live comfortably. I believed my hard work and sacrifice would give him everything I never had: respect, stability, and success. But one day, my own son poured boiling soup on my hands because I spilled a little water on the floor. That moment changed me forever. The pain didn't come from the burn, but from realizing my blood had turned cold toward me. But I didn't fight him. I acted quietly. What happened next changed his entire life. Before that, tell me where you're watching from. For most of his life, the father had known only two things: work and love. He came from a generation that believed in doing things by hand, where effort was the language of care. Every sunrise found him in his small kitchen, sleeves rolled up, apron tied, preparing breakfast for his family before heading to his shift at the factory. His palms were calloused from years of labor, but they held the warmth of a man who never complained. To him, love wasn't spoken. It was cooked, cleaned, and earned one long day at a time. When his son was born, everything changed. The father saw in him a continuation of everything he had struggled for. He wanted his boy to grow into something greater, not a man of sweat and sore muscles, but a man of ideas and ambition. Every meal he cooked, every coin he saved, every hour he worked overtime, he did it with his son in mind. His dream was simple: to build a foundation so strong that his son would never have to struggle the way he did. The boy grew quickly, bright and full of curiosity. He loved following his father around the kitchen, watching how every dish came together: a pinch of salt, a turn of the wrist, a careful eye on the heat. The father would smile, showing him small tricks: how to hold a knife properly, how to taste before seasoning, how food wasn't just about filling the stomach, but about feeding the heart. In those early years, the son admired his father. He said he wanted to cook just like him. Years passed, and the father continued working tirelessly. When the factory closed down, he didn't complain. He simply started working part-time in a diner, washing dishes and chopping vegetables for long hours. He took pride in the smell of garlic and onion in his hands, in the sizzling sound of a pan that meant another day's meal was secure. His body grew older, but his resolve never weakened. Every rupee, every dollar saved, went into a small envelope labeled with his son's name. When the boy graduated high school, the father did something that would change both their lives. He sold a piece of inherited land to pay for his son's culinary school. It wasn't easy. That land had belonged to his ancestors, and selling it felt like letting go of a piece of his family's history. But he told himself it was worth it. His son had a gift, a natural sense for flavor, an instinct for creation, and he wanted to give him every chance to succeed. The father watched proudly as his son went through school, earning praise from teachers and peers alike. Every phone call from him was filled with stories about recipes, about kitchens, about new dishes, and big dreams. The old man would listen with tears in his eyes, feeling both pride and distance. He knew his son was stepping into a world he could never fully understand, a world of bright lights, restaurants, and names printed on menus. But it made him happy. When his son finally graduated, he didn't return home empty-handed. He came back with plans. Big ones. He wanted to open his own restaurant. He spoke about investors, menus, branding, reputation, words that sounded big and foreign in the small kitchen where his father still cooked the same old meals. The father didn't understand all of it, but he smiled anyway. When the boy asked for help, a small loan to start his dream, the old man didn't hesitate. He emptied his savings. Every coin, every note, every bit of gold he had stored away for his old age went into helping his son open the restaurant. He told himself it wasn't a risk. It was an investment in love. The restaurant opened a few months later, a small but beautiful place on a quiet street. The walls were warm, the tables were polished, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The father stood quietly in the corner during the opening night, dressed in his best shirt, watching his son smile for photographs. For the first time in his life, the old man felt he had done enough. He thought that his years of sacrifice had finally led to something good, a future that carried his legacy forward. He began helping in the restaurant every morning, washing vegetables, cleaning the kitchen floor, doing whatever small work his son asked of him. He didn't want to interfere. He only wanted to stay close, to see his son's dream bloom. At first, things were good. His son treated him kindly, if a little formally. The staff respected him, calling him sir. He felt proud to be part of something bigger than himself. But as weeks turned into months, something began to shift. The son's tone changed, sharper, more impatient. The restaurant grew busier, and success brought with it an arrogance the father had never seen before. Small mistakes began to matter too much. A misplaced spoon, a delayed delivery, a tray left in the wrong corner, all became reasons for irritation. The father started staying quieter, moving slower, trying not to be noticed. He told himself it was stress, that his son was only tired, that running a business came with pressure. But deep down, something inside him began to ache, not from the work, but from the distance that had begun to grow between them. Still, he kept showing up every morning. He couldn't stop himself. That restaurant wasn't just his son's dream. It was built with his money, his labor, his belief. Every plate that went out carried a piece of his heart, whether his son saw it or not. He would come early, sweeping floors before anyone arrived, making tea for the staff, arranging ingredients, polishing cutlery. The young workers often smiled kindly at him, calling him uncle. They respected his patience and humility. But when his son arrived, the air in the kitchen would change. The laughter would fade, orders would fly, tempers would flare, and the father would shrink into silence. One day, the son told him not to come into the kitchen during service hours. He said it was unprofessional. The words stung. That kitchen had once been their shared space, a sacred place of lessons and laughter. Now, it was a battlefield where one stood tall and the other bowed quietly. The father obeyed. He spent his days cleaning storage shelves and organizing supplies instead. He began taking lunch alone in the corner, eating plain rice from a small tiffin box while the others bustled around. But even in that quiet isolation, he never complained. He kept working, kept believing, kept hoping that love would one day return where pride now lived. Every evening, when the restaurant closed, he would sit by the door, waiting for his son to finish checking the books. Sometimes the boy would nod at him and say, "Good night." Sometimes he wouldn't even look up. The father would smile anyway, whispering a silent prayer before heading home. He had built his life around that boy's happiness. He had given up his health, his savings, his comfort, and yet, standing there in the restaurant that bore the fruit of his sacrifice, he had never felt more invisible. But still, he loved him. Still, he woke every morning before dawn to go back. Still, he believed that maybe tomorrow things would be better. That quiet hope was what kept him going, until the night when everything changed. The change didn't happen overnight. It began with small, invisible cracks, little moments of disrespect that most people would overlook. But to a father who had built his entire life on love and sacrifice, those cracks felt like wounds. At first, the son's tone shifted. Where there had once been gratitude, there was now impatience. He no longer spoke with warmth. His words carried weight, sharpness, and a touch of arrogance that came with success. The restaurant was doing well. Reviews were good, customers filled the seats, and the name outside, his son's name, began to shine brighter than anything else. Pride, once the fuel of their bond, started becoming poison. The father noticed it in the way his son called his name. It used to be soft, respectful. Now, it was short, clipped, as though even saying it was an inconvenience. He began to feel like an intruder in a place he had helped create. Staff members started treating him like a helper, not a co-owner. They didn't mean harm, but they followed the energy of the man in charge. And that man, his son, no longer saw his father as equal, only as someone in the way. Sometimes the father would make small mistakes, spilling flour, misplacing a utensil, forgetting which shelf held the oil. His son would sigh loudly in front of everyone, shaking his head, calling him clumsy. The first time it happened, the father smiled weakly and said nothing. The second time, he forced a laugh, hoping it would ease the tension. The third time, he simply turned away. By the 10th, he stopped looking up altogether, But words can bruise in ways even fists cannot. Each public remark chipped away at something inside him. The father began to move slower, quieter, trying not to attract attention. The staff began whispering, saying he was too old for the kitchen, that maybe he should retire. Every comment, every sigh, every eye roll added another invisible weight to his heart. Still, he kept working. Every morning, he showed up early, before dawn, to make tea, to sweep the floor, to prepare ingredients. He told himself he was helping, even when no one asked for his help. He told himself he was part of something beautiful, even as that beauty began to sour. The son, meanwhile, grew busier and prouder. Success inflated his ego. He dressed sharper, spoke louder, and stopped listening to advice. The restaurant was expanding. He was planning a second branch, and journalists had begun to write about his hard work and vision. The father read those articles in silence, feeling pride fight against pain. His name wasn't mentioned once, not as investor, not as founder, not even as inspiration. It wasn't the omission that hurt. It was the erasure. One evening, while closing up, the father found a magazine featuring his son on the cover. Beneath the smiling photo, the caption read, "From rags to riches, the young chef who built it all from nothing." The father ran his hand across the page, tracing the boy's face. His eyes watered, not from anger, but from the quiet realization that in his son's new world, there was no space for the truth. As days went on, the distance between them grew like rot beneath polished wood. His son stopped sitting with him for lunch. When he did, he scrolled through his phone, barely speaking. The staff, once friendly, began avoiding him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of displeasing the boss. One night, after hours, the father accidentally overheard a conversation between two young chefs. They were laughing about the old man in the back who couldn't even carry trays properly. One of them said, "He's just here because the boss pities him." The other replied, "Yeah, maybe the old man used to wash dishes for free or something." They didn't know who he was. They didn't know he had sold his land, his savings, and his future for that restaurant. He stepped out quietly before they saw him, walked to the storeroom, and sat down on an empty crate. He didn't cry. He just stared at his palms, rough, wrinkled, strong, and wondered when his worth had faded from respect to pity. The next morning, his son barked at him for rearranging stock incorrectly. His voice carried across the restaurant. The father froze, standing still with a small box in his hands. The staff looked away awkwardly. Some smiled faintly in embarrassment. Others kept working as if nothing had happened. The old man nodded, placed the box down, and whispered an apology that no one heard. That night, when he left, he didn't even look back at the glowing restaurant sign. The pride it once brought now felt like a reminder of what he had lost. Not his money, not his time, but his son's respect. And yet, he returned the next day. Because love, even when unreturned, becomes habit. He told himself he couldn't abandon the boy. He told himself it was stress, youth, ego, anything that made the cruelty sound temporary. He remembered how his son once hugged him after a burnt dish, how he once said, "You're the best cook I know." That memory was all he had, and he clung to it like a man gripping a photograph in a storm. But things kept getting worse. His son's tone hardened. Orders came out like commands. The father began to sense something dark, not just arrogance, but contempt. The boy saw his father's kindness as weakness, his humility as irrelevance. He treated his staff better than he treated the man who raised him. And still, the father endured. He knew confrontation would only humiliate him further. So he endured the small slights, the cold glances, the sharp words, the laughter that sometimes followed his mistakes. He endured it all with quiet strength, telling himself it was worth it to stay near his son. But deep inside, something was shifting, something cold and still. The father, once filled with warmth and forgiveness, began to understand a painful truth. Love without respect becomes slavery. That realization didn't come in one dramatic moment. It crept in like evening fog, slow, invisible, suffocating. He began keeping copies of documents, ownership papers, loan receipts, bank transactions, quietly stored in a small metal box under his bed. Not because he planned to use them, but because part of him knew that someday love wouldn't protect him anymore. By now, the burns on his soul had started long before the soup ever touched his skin. The cruelty had already begun, invisible, unacknowledged, but real. Every insult, every dismissal, every public shame was a drop in a boiling pot that would one day spill over. He didn't yet know that day would come soon. He didn't know how far his son's temper would go. But something inside him, the part that had survived years of hard labor and disappointment, was already bracing. Because when love turns to cruelty and patience turns to pain, even the gentlest heart learns how to protect itself. The first cuts may not bleed, but they teach a man how to hold the knife when the time comes. It was a Friday evening, the busiest night of the week. The restaurant was alive with noise, laughter, and the sharp clatter of utensils against plates. Steam clouded the kitchen windows, the air thick with the smell of garlic, spice, and ambition. The father had been there since morning, helping prepare ingredients, cleaning counters, and filling water jugs for the staff. He moved slowly now, not from laziness, but from the years carved into his bones. Still, he worked with care. Every movement carried memory of a time when food meant family, not fame. The rush had begun. Orders flew in like arrows. The son's voice echoed through the kitchen, commanding, loud, impatient. His once gentle tone had hardened into something cold and mechanical. He barked at waiters, scolded cooks, and slammed utensils when things didn't go his way. The father watched quietly from the prep station, trying to stay out of his path. He had learned long ago that his son's temper was a storm best avoided, but the old man still loved being there. Even after the insults, even after the distance, he still found comfort in the rhythm of the kitchen, the hiss of oil, the scent of simmering broth, the dance of fire beneath metal. It reminded him of the days when he and his boy used to cook side by side in their small home, experimenting with spices, laughing over burnt chapatis, tasting and learning together. Those were days when mistakes led to lessons, not shouting. As the restaurant filled, the pressure grew. The staff moved like a wave, synchronized but tense. Every delay drew an angry glare from the son. The father noticed how tightly his son's jaw was set, how his hands trembled slightly with frustration. Success had made him hungry, not for food, but for perfection, for control. And anything that disturbed that illusion, even by a second, ignited his fury. The father had been asked to refill a pitcher of water, a simple task, one he had done 1,000 times before. He walked to the counter, filled it carefully, and turned toward the table. The floor was slick. Oil and water had mixed from a spill no one had cleaned. His foot slipped just enough to make the water slosh over the rim, spilling a few drops near the serving counter. It was nothing, a small accident. But to the son, standing just a few feet away, it was an unforgivable mistake. The kitchen froze. The sound of sizzling pans faded beneath the silence that followed. The son turned slowly, his eyes narrow, his expression unreadable. The father opened his mouth to apologize, but before he could speak, the son's voice cut through the air like a blade. His words were loud, cruel, and full of contempt. Everyone stopped moving. The young cooks stared. The waiters froze mid-step. The father's face flushed with shame. He didn't look up. He simply nodded and reached for a rag to clean the small puddle. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced a faint smile. "It's fine," he wanted to say. But before the thought could form, the son's rage broke fully. Without warning, he grabbed a ladle from the stove, one still filled with boiling soup, and flung it across the counter. The thick liquid splashed onto the father's hands, scalding his skin instantly. A scream tore from his throat before he could stop it. The pain was blinding, searing, the kind that shoots straight to the heart. The kitchen erupted in chaos. One of the cooks rushed to help, another froze in shock. The father stumbled back, clutching his hands, steam rising from his skin. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the whispers began. Did he just, "Oh my God," call someone? But the son just stood there, breathing hard, his face twisted between anger and guilt. For a brief moment, he looked like he wanted to say something, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify himself. But he said nothing. He turned away instead, barking orders as though nothing had happened. The father's hands throbbed violently. He couldn't feel his fingertips, only the deep burn beneath the skin. A waiter handed him a towel soaked in cold water. He wrapped it around his palms, biting his lip to keep from groaning. The pain wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. This wasn't the first time his son had hurt him with words. But this was different. This was a wound made of both fire and betrayal. He stood there for a moment, looking at his son, the boy he had once held with those same hands, the boy he had taught to cook, the boy whose first meal he had praised, whose dreams he had financed, whose name he had carried like a badge of pride. Now that boy had thrown fire at him, not metaphorically, but literally. Slowly, the father walked out of the kitchen. The towel around his hands was damp and stained with pain. He didn't look back. He could hear the son yelling again, barking at his staff, pretending nothing had happened. But the silence that followed him out the back door was louder than any noise inside. He sat down on a crate behind the restaurant. The night air was cold, and the stars above were hidden behind city smoke. He unwrapped the towel, looked at his blistered palms, and exhaled slowly. The skin was red and swollen, but the burn inside him, the one in his chest, hurt far worse. A young cook came out to check on him. The boy hesitated, unsure whether to speak. The father nodded gently, signaling he was fine. He didn't want witnesses to his humiliation. He didn't want pity. After a few minutes, he stood up and walked home. Every step hurt, not from his hands, but from the weight of realization pressing on his back. That restaurant, that dream, that son, none of it belonged to him anymore. At home, he rinsed his hands with cold water and wrapped them in cloth. The pain pulsed like a heartbeat, but the tears refused to come. He sat in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the city outside his window. His mind kept replaying the moment, the boiling soup, the look on his son's face, the shock on the worker's eyes. He wondered when exactly his son had stopped being his son. Was it the first time he raised his voice? Was it the day he claimed the restaurant as his own? Or was it tonight, when he turned his father's kindness into an excuse for cruelty? Whatever the answer, one truth stood firm. Something had ended. Not just a relationship, but a part of himself, the part that still believed love could fix everything. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window until dawn, his bandaged hands resting on his knees. He thought about his life, about every sacrifice he had made, every choice he had defended in the name of family. And slowly, between the ache and the silence, something inside him hardened. He realized that silence had protected the wrong person for too long. He had endured disrespect, believing it was love. He had excused cruelty, thinking it was stress. But now he understood. Kindness without limits becomes permission for abuse. By sunrise, he had made his decision. The burns would heal, but his patience would not. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to fight. He wasn't going to seek revenge out of hate. He was going to take back what was his, calmly, legally, and permanently. Because sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one holding the loudest power, and this time he was done being silent. The night after the burn, the world felt heavier than ever before. The pain in his hands was sharp, but it was the ache in his heart that refused to fade. He sat by the window, the bandages still damp, his mind replaying the moment over and over. The sound of boiling soup, the sting of the splash, the silence that followed. Not one person in that kitchen had spoken up. Not one had dared to question what they saw. It wasn't just the heat that burned him. It was the realization that love, respect, and memory had all vanished in the same instant. He had spent a lifetime believing that love was enough to protect him, that kindness would be returned in kind. But in that small kitchen, under fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt oil, he had seen what love turned into when mixed with pride, indifference. His son hadn't just thrown soup. He had thrown away their bond, their history, their years of laughter and struggle. The father's reflection in the dark window didn't look like the man he remembered. It looked like someone emptied of hope, holding on only to routine. The next morning, he didn't go to the restaurant. His hands were too swollen to work anyway, but even if they weren't, he couldn't have walked through those doors again. He sat quietly at his small kitchen table, a cup of tea untouched before him. Outside, the city buzzed as usual, unaware that a father's world had ended. He looked around his house, the faded curtains, the cracked photo frames, the peeling paint. Everything was old, but every object carried a story. The framed photo of his son's graduation, the brass cooking pot that had belonged to his wife before she passed, the small wooden box where he kept his papers, his savings, his identity. Everything he had was built for someone else, for the future of a boy who no longer saw him as anything but a burden. As he sat there, he realized something powerful. His silence had protected everyone but himself. Every time he had chosen not to speak, it wasn't peace he was keeping. It was permission he was giving. Permission for his son to treat him like help. Permission for staff to mock him. Permission for love to die quietly, without resistance. And now, even as his skin stung and his heart throbbed, he understood that this silence had to end. Not with violence, not with anger, but with clarity. He wasn't going to fight back with the same cruelty. He had no interest in shouting matches or apologies. He wanted something deeper, a resolution that came with dignity, something that would show his son that the man he thought was weak had only been patient. He began to think about what he still controlled: his mind, his will, his paperwork, the quiet powers that the proud often forget. He remembered that the restaurant had been started with his savings, his name on the papers. Back then, his son was too young to handle legal matters, so the ownership had been shared. Later, the son took over management, but the legal foundation remained the same. He stood up slowly, his hands aching as he unlatched the small wooden box from his cupboard. Inside were the documents, the ones he hadn't looked at in years: bank receipts, property forms, the loan papers he'd co-signed, his son's restaurant license, and his own signature on the bottom line of every page. He sat there for hours, going through each sheet carefully, his eyes sharp despite his age. He realized something that changed everything. His son might have built the name, but the structure, the soul, the ownership, all began with him. He was still tied to every account, every investment, every license. The boy might have forgotten, but the law hadn't. The father smiled faintly. It wasn't a smile of revenge, but of awakening. For the first time in years, he felt in control, not emotionally, but practically. All these years, he had been made to feel small, dependent, irrelevant. But as his fingers traced the ink of his own name, he realized he had never been powerless. He had simply been too kind to use the power he already had. That night, he didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't because of pain. It was because of clarity. He thought of every insult, every dismissal, every time he'd been made to feel like a burden. And in the middle of that storm of memory, he felt calm. He didn't want to hurt his son. He wanted to restore balance. He wanted to remind him that the man he mocked was the same man who had built his world. He got up early the next morning and looked at his hands. The skin was healing, still red, but stronger. He took it as a sign. Strength always returns quietly. After breakfast, he put on his best shirt, the same one he'd worn when his son's restaurant first opened. It was clean, faded at the collar, but it carried history. He looked at himself in the mirror, wrinkles deep, eyes sharp. For the first time in a long while, he saw not weakness, but authority. He picked up the documents and stepped out. The air outside felt lighter than before. Every step to the lawyer's office was slow but steady. He didn't rush. Patience had always been his ally, and now it would be his weapon. When he reached the office, the lawyer, an old friend, greeted him with concern. The father didn't mention the burns. He didn't mention the soup or the humiliation. He spoke only of business, of documents, of ownership. The lawyer listened, then nodded, confirming what the father already suspected. Everything his son had built still stood on the foundation of his name. It took hours to review everything, to draft papers, to shift authority where it rightfully belonged. Every signature was like reclaiming a piece of himself. There was no anger in his pen strokes, only precision. When he left the office, the sun was setting, washing the city in gold. He walked home slower this time, feeling a strange sense of peace. The burns still hurt, but they no longer felt like punishment. They felt like transformation, the fire that had melted away years of silence. At home, he made tea for himself, for the first time without thinking of anyone else. The house was quiet, but not lonely. It was the sound of freedom, the kind that comes when a man finally stops apologizing for existing. He looked again at the restaurant's name on one of the papers. It still bore his son's brand, shiny, modern, confident. But beneath it was the faint signature that started it all, his own. He realized then that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, and if it is lost, it must be taught, not through shouting, but through reality. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about what would come next. He wasn't interested in confrontation. He didn't want revenge that destroyed. He wanted correction that healed. But healing sometimes requires loss. He whispered a quiet promise to himself before falling asleep. Tomorrow, I will take back what is mine, not for pride, but for peace. It wasn't anger that guided him anymore. It was justice, calm, precise, and overdue. Morning came quietly, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The air smelled of rain, and the faint golden light stretched across his small kitchen table. His hands still ached, but the sting was different now, less of pain, more of purpose. The old man sat with a cup of tea, staring at the documents that now lay before him like silent witnesses. Each page, each signature, each seal was a piece of his life, one that he had built through sweat, patience, and years of sacrifice. He had made his choice. He would not yell, not fight, not curse. He would act, precisely, calmly, lawfully. There was something almost sacred in his calm. The anger had already burned out with the soup. What remained was clarity, the kind that comes after fire, when ashes settle and the truth becomes visible again. He looked at the restaurant license again. His name sat there beside his son's, but his son had forgotten what that meant. Ownership was more than money. It was a legacy, a story written in blood and effort. He had given that boy his foundation. Now, the same foundation would remind the boy where he came from and what he had destroyed. He folded the papers neatly, placed them in an envelope, and put them in his jacket pocket. Then he looked around his home one last time. The cracked walls, the wooden chairs, the faded photos on the shelf. He stopped at one photograph, his son, maybe 10 years old, standing proudly beside him with a small bowl of soup they had made together. Both of them smiling, both unaware of how time would twist that moment into something cruel. He touched the glass frame gently. This, he thought, was the last time we cooked with love. Then he turned away. At the lawyer's office, he moved with quiet determination. The assistant greeted him respectfully. She had seen him before. She remembered his steady nature. He explained what needed to be done. Every word he spoke was clear and calm. There was no hesitation, no tremor in his voice. The lawyer nodded as the plan took shape. Together, they reviewed ownership documents, bank accounts, and financial statements. It took hours, line after line, page after page. But the old man didn't tire. Each detail revealed something new, something powerful. His son had built an empire, yes, but every brick of it rested on the father's foundation. There were co-signed loans, joint accounts, legal clauses that kept the father's approval necessary for any sale, expansion, or loan renegotiation. His son had been too eager to rise, too proud to read the fine print. The father smiled faintly. Life had given him everything he needed, not revenge, but leverage. He began signing the necessary transfers, quietly moving control back into his own name. The lawyer explained the implications. By the time these were processed, the restaurant, its assets, and all related legal powers would rest solely under his ownership again. It wasn't theft. It wasn't trickery. It was restoration, the law reclaiming what time and disrespect had taken away. He didn't rush. Every signature was steady, deliberate. With each pen stroke, he felt lighter, as if the burns on his hands were being replaced with strength. When the final document was done, the lawyer looked at him and said softly, "It's done." The old man leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Leaving the office, he didn't feel victorious. He felt whole again. The walk home was long, but easy. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, warm on his face. He stopped by a tea stall, bought himself a cup, and sat on the bench outside. He watched the people pass, busy, hurried, distracted, and wondered how many of them had fathers who still waited for a kind word. He realized how many parents die long before their hearts stop, killed not by time, but by neglect. He thought of the soup, of the heat, of the betrayal, and felt no hate, only distance. Some things are too heavy to carry. Some wounds heal best when left uncovered. When he got home, he placed the remaining documents in his drawer and closed it quietly. The decision was now beyond emotion. The papers would move through the system, banks, registries, legal offices, and soon his son would wake to a world rearranged by truth. That night, he wrote in his old notebook. Not a letter, not a confession, just a few words for himself. Silence is not weakness. It is patience waiting for its moment. The following days passed uneventfully. He didn't visit the restaurant. He didn't call. He didn't send messages. He let time do its work, quietly and efficiently. Each day, he felt stronger, not because of revenge, but because of release. He was done being small in his own story. At times, he wondered if his son would ever realize what had happened. Would he remember the soup? Would he remember the burns? Would he ever feel shame? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But it no longer mattered. The father had stopped living for apologies. He was living for peace now. One evening, a week later, he received a phone call from his lawyer. The process was complete. The restaurant was legally his. Every right, every signature, every title belonged to him now. The old man didn't smile, didn't cheer. He just whispered a quiet thank you and hung up. Then he sat by his window again, the same place he had once sat, bandaged and broken. But now there was no pain, no ache, only calm. Outside, rain began to fall, slow at first, then heavy, washing the streets, clearing the dust. He watched the drops race down the glass, each one catching the faint light of the street lamps. It felt like the world itself was cleaning something old. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. He brewed a small pot of soup, the simple kind, the kind he used to make before restaurants and business and pride. As the steam rose, he looked at his hands. The burns had healed, leaving only faint marks, reminders, not scars. He held the bowl carefully, inhaled the familiar scent, and smiled. It wasn't bitterness he tasted now. It was closure. Tomorrow, he knew, the news would reach his son. There would be anger, confusion, shouting, maybe even pleading. But the father wouldn't be there to see it. He had done his part. The lesson was already written, not in words, but in signatures, in silence, in the strength of calm decisions. Because revenge isn't always noise and rage. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and perfectly legal. And when it arrives, it doesn't destroy. It simply restores balance. That night, he slept soundly, the rain tapping softly on the window like forgiveness. He had made his decision, and it was final. The morning after his final decision felt different. The air in his small home was lighter, as though something unseen had been lifted from his shoulders. He no longer carried the weight of confusion, only direction. For the first time in years, he wasn't reacting to pain. He was creating purpose. The burns on his hands had begun to fade, leaving behind soft red marks that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat. Silent reminders of what had been done and what had now begun. He dressed carefully, not because anyone was watching, but because dignity mattered, even in solitude. His shirt was freshly ironed, his shoes polished, and his jacket carried the faint scent of old leather, the same one he had worn the day his son's restaurant first opened. It was almost poetic, he thought, how that same jacket would now witness the undoing of everything that arrogance had built. By mid-morning, he was at the bank. The marble floor echoed softly as he walked toward the loan manager's office. He carried an envelope with documents neatly organized inside, proof of ownership, legal amendments, and his co-signed agreements. The manager greeted him politely, unaware that the visit would alter the fate of a business that had once been celebrated in local magazines. He explained his request calmly, without bitterness. "I would like to review the existing loan arrangements under my name," he said. The manager nodded, pulling up files and transaction histories. Numbers filled the screen: repayments, pending interests, registered co-owners. And there it was. His name, printed clearly beside his son's, like a ghost from the past that had been waiting patiently to be remembered. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I'd like to assume full responsibility for the loan and settle what remains." The manager blinked, slightly surprised, but nodded. The process began. With each signature, each authorization, the father quietly tightened the noose that would soon remind his son what legacy truly meant. He didn't do it to destroy. He did it to reclaim. The restaurant had been born from his savings. Every coin he had earned hauling crates, every night he had gone hungry so his son could attend school, every dream he had deferred so the boy could dream bigger. Now that dream had burned him, and the law, patient and impartial, would return the fire in ink and stamps. When the paperwork was complete, he thanked the manager and walked to his next stop, a business consultant who had once advised him during the restaurant's early days. The man still remembered him, still respected him. They spoke quietly about the next steps: legal transfer of ownership, valuation, potential buyers. Everything was above board. Every step was documented. Within 3 days, the restaurant's ownership had been reverted entirely to him. His son's name still hung over the door, but only as a signboard, not a legal truth. The father now held every right, every account, every key. He waited a few more days before making his next move. The transition had to be clean. The new buyers, a small family with dreams as humble as his once were ready. Papers were signed, payments arranged. He watched as they smiled, full of gratitude and excitement, just as his son once had. It almost hurt to see it, but he felt something close to peace. When the sale was finalized, the funds transferred quietly into his personal account. No announcements, no celebrations, only the sound of quiet justice finding its way home. The following Monday, he decided to visit the restaurant one last time. It was evening, the hour when customers filled the tables and laughter spilled into the street. The neon sign glowed bright, bearing his son's name. Inside, waiters rushed between tables, carrying trays of steaming food. The air was thick with the smell of roasted spices and noise. It looked just as it always had, except for one thing. Everything inside it now belonged to him again. He stood by the doorway for a few minutes, unnoticed. His son was there, shouting orders, face red from stress and pride. He moved from counter to counter, loud and restless, like a man who believed he owned the world. The father watched quietly, almost pitying him. Then, as if on cue, a group of men in formal suits entered. They were the representatives from the buyer's group, there to finalize the possession. His son noticed them, confused, then curious. He wiped his hands, greeted them, asked what they wanted. That's when the whispers began, the staff murmuring, heads turning. One of the men handed his son an envelope. The son tore it open, scanned the pages, and his expression froze. The color drained from his face. The documents inside bore seals, signatures, legal authority. The transfer of ownership finalized, registered, irreversible. The restaurant was no longer his. It belonged entirely to someone else. The room fell silent. Even the sound of the kitchen stopped for a moment. The son looked up, eyes wild, scanning the room, and then he saw his father. The old man stood near the entrance, his posture calm, his hands resting easily by his side. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, acknowledging what had to be done. The son stepped forward, his voice trembling. But before any words could escape, one of the new owners approached him gently and said, "It's done. You'll need to vacate by tonight." That was it. No shouting match, no tears, just the clean finality of truth. The father turned and walked away as the murmurs rose behind him. His son's voice cracked, somewhere between anger and disbelief, but the old man didn't turn around. The night air outside was cool, the streetlights soft. Each step away from that restaurant felt like stepping into a new life, one free from humiliation, one built on quiet strength. He walked until he reached the park across the street. The benches were empty, the trees whispering softly in the wind. He sat down, resting his palms on his knees. The faint ache from his healed burns pulsed again, not in pain, but in memory. He thought about how strange justice can be. Sometimes it shouts, sometimes it whispers, but the truest kind comes quietly, through patience, through dignity, through the strength to act without hate. He didn't want his son to suffer. He wanted him to understand that cruelty has consequences and love has limits, that every foundation has a builder and every builder deserves respect. As he sat there, a group of workers passed by carrying boxes, the last few items from the restaurant. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What was done was done. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, a duplicate of the final sale papers. He folded it neatly and placed it inside his inner pocket. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that silence can be power and patience can be justice. That night, when he returned home, he didn't feel the usual heaviness in his chest. He cooked himself a simple meal, rice, vegetables, and soup. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. For the first time in years, every flavor tasted real again. He looked out the window at the city lights shimmering across the distance and smiled faintly. The world hadn't changed. He had. And in that quiet change, he found freedom. The following morning unfolded like any other in the busy heart of the city. People hurried down the sidewalks, unaware that just beyond one corner of town, a story of pride and consequence was reaching its quiet conclusion. The old man woke early, as he always did, long before dawn stretched its fingers across the skyline. The night before had been the first in years where he'd slept soundly. No restless turning, no clenched fists, no echo of his son's voice in his mind. Only peace. He brewed his tea slowly, the steam rising like a curtain between him and the past. On the table before him lay the final documents of ownership, stamped, sealed, and irreversible. His name stood alone now. No shared claim, no dependent clause, just his, as it had been at the beginning. The father of the restaurant had reclaimed not just the business, but his dignity. He didn't plan to go back that day, but fate seemed to have its own schedule. Around mid-morning, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but he recognized the tone, hesitant, uncertain. A familiar voice from the restaurant staff whispered, "Sir, you should come. It's better if you're here." He didn't rush. He simply nodded, ended the call, and prepared himself. His steps, though slow, carried purpose. When he reached the restaurant, the air outside was thick with murmurs. Employees stood gathered near the entrance, customers peering through the windows, confusion spreading like wildfire. The sign above the door gleamed under the sunlight, but beneath it, the mood was heavy, uneasy. He paused before entering. Through the glass, he could see his son pacing near the counter, his movements frantic. The staff kept their distance, whispering among themselves. Papers were scattered across the counter, the same documents that confirmed what had already been done. The takeover was complete, and the buyers were here to make it official in person. The father stepped inside. The moment he entered, the sound of footsteps faltered. Conversation stopped. Even the clatter of utensils from the kitchen seemed to fade. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. He walked slowly, deliberately, each step echoing through the tiled floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down to a truth that could no longer be avoided. His son turned. For a heartbeat, silence, then shock, then anger. "Why are you here?" his son demanded, voice trembling with fury and disbelief. The father didn't answer. He simply walked to the counter, looked down at the papers, and then looked back up at his son, not as a parent, but as a man reclaiming his rightful ground. The buyers stood to one side, their expressions uneasy but respectful. They understood what this was, not a business transaction anymore, but the unmasking of pride. The eldest of them cleared his throat softly and handed over the final confirmation letter. "The transfer is now fully complete," he said to the father before turning to the son. "We'll take full possession at the end of the day." The son's lips parted, disbelief twisting his face. "You can't do this," he hissed. "This is my restaurant. I built this place." The father looked at him, his gaze calm but firm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence held more power than any argument could. Then, in a tone so soft it almost vanished in the air, he said the only thing that mattered, "You forgot who built you." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through the room, through the hearts of everyone who heard them. The son's face flushed with rage. He tried to argue, to shout, to point fingers. He accused the buyers, the lawyer, even the staff. But the truth was written in ink, sealed by law, and standing right before him in the quiet figure of his father. Every attempt to twist the story crumbled under the weight of reality. The staff, those who had once feared the son's temper, now looked at him differently. The whispering stopped. Eyes that once darted away from confrontation now held steady. They had seen the truth too. The father didn't linger. He didn't need to watch his son's anger unravel. He turned toward the door, ready to leave this chapter behind. But as he reached the threshold, he paused, just long enough to glance back once more. The son had fallen silent, staring at the papers that had erased his empire. The arrogance that once burned in his expression was gone, replaced by something smaller, sadder, confusion, maybe even regret. The father didn't smile. He didn't want to. Victory wasn't the goal. Peace was. Outside, the sunlight broke fully through the clouds, flooding the street with gold. He stepped into it, blinking at the warmth. For the first time in a long while, he felt it. The sun, the air, the weightless quiet of freedom. He took a slow breath, letting it fill his lungs. Behind him, the buyers began organizing the transition. Staff followed orders. The restaurant, once a monument to arrogance, now became a symbol of humility and renewal. The old man's lesson had taken form not through lectures, but through consequence. He walked down the street, his pace steady. People brushed past him, some carrying groceries, others talking on their phones. The world moved on, indifferent to the small revolutions that happened quietly inside broken families. But for him, this was everything. He stopped at a crosswalk and looked at his reflection in a shop window. The man staring back at him looked older, yes, lines deeper, shoulders bent. But his eyes were alive again. There was no bitterness there, only resolve. He thought of his wife, long gone now. He imagined her voice, calm, kind, proud. She would have told him he did the right thing, not because it hurt their son, but because it restored what cruelty had stolen: respect. Later that evening, he sat on the bench outside his home. The city hummed quietly around him. He held his cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into his palms. He thought about how strange life could be, how love and betrayal could share the same roof, how silence could turn into strength. He knew his son would try to call. He knew there would be apologies, excuses, tears. But he also knew that words could never undo what was done. When his phone buzzed, he didn't even look at the screen. He let it ring until it stopped. Some lessons aren't meant to be spoken. They're meant to be lived. The father leaned back, exhaling softly. Somewhere in the distance, he could smell the faint aroma of food, perhaps from another small restaurant, one built by hands that still remembered gratitude. It made him smile, not out of pride, but out of peace. He had taken nothing that wasn't already his. He had destroyed no one, only revealed what truth had been hiding. Sometimes, he thought, justice doesn't come from courts or confrontation. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet, perfect balance, when a man who has been humiliated stands again, not as a fighter, but as the proof that dignity cannot be stolen. That night, he slept again, and this time his dreams were simple. He dreamt of the fields from his childhood, of soil under his nails, of his young son running barefoot beside him, laughing. He dreamt of his wife stirring soup in their small kitchen, humming softly. And in that dream, no one shouted, no one burned. There was only warmth and peace, and the taste of forgiveness that time alone can give. When he woke the next morning, the world was still. The papers on his table were already filed away. The restaurant was gone from his name, passed on to its new owners, and his son, somewhere perhaps, was learning that the cost of cruelty is not measured in money, but in moments lost forever. He stood, stretched his stiff back, and whispered a final thought to the quiet morning air. I didn't take his restaurant to win. I took it to remind him who fed him first. And with that, the old man made himself a cup of tea and stepped into another day, lighter, freer, and untouchable. The storm that followed was silent at first. The kind of storm that doesn't shout, but erases everything in its path through stillness. For days after the transfer, the son's life began to unravel piece by piece, like fabric fraying at the edges. The restaurant that had once buzzed with noise, customers, and pride now stood under new management. The sign still bore his name for a short while, a fading echo of ownership. But inside, it no longer belonged to him. He had been asked to vacate quietly, to leave without scene or scandal, and he did, though not out of grace. He left because he had no choice. The father heard about it not through the papers or social media, but from a friend who still worked part-time at the restaurant. He's been coming around at night, the man said softly. Just stands across the street and stares through the windows. Doesn't speak to anyone. The father didn't respond. He simply nodded, thanked him, and hung up. The news didn't bring him joy. It brought something heavier, the kind of ache that sits behind your ribs, reminding you that love doesn't vanish, even when it's been bruised. Still, he knew this was necessary. The world doesn't always teach through comfort. Sometimes it needs pain to carve lessons deep enough to be remembered. As the days turned into weeks, the son's downfall became visible to everyone who once envied his arrogance. Suppliers began demanding payments, creditors withdrew their support. The bank accounts that once overflowed with business revenue now stood empty. The new owners had paid cleanly, but the money from the sale, the part his son believed he was entitled to, had never reached him. It had gone directly to the father's account, secured and untouchable. Friends, the ones who used to toast to his success, stopped returning calls. The city's chatter shifted from admiration to ridicule, and pride, that towering illusion he had built, began to crumble. Meanwhile, the father lived quietly. He spent mornings walking to the market, afternoons tending to small plants on his balcony, and evenings sipping tea by the window. Peace had returned to his life like sunlight after a long winter. But there were moments, quiet ones, when memory would stir. He would remember the day of the burn, the shock in his son's eyes when the truth came crashing down, and the silence that followed. He didn't hate him, not anymore. He had simply stopped trying to carry him. Justice, he had learned, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about putting weight where it belongs. One afternoon, he received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just his name, written in shaky handwriting he knew too well. Inside was a single folded letter. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The letter was short. No excuses, no explanations. Just a few uneven lines. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope one day you'll remember me for who I was, before I forgot what respect meant. The father read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his drawer. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The lesson had already been lived. In town, whispers still followed the story. Some said the old man had ruined his son's life. Others said he had saved it. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler. He had reminded him where everything began, who built the foundation, who paid the first bill, who sacrificed first and ate last. And maybe, deep inside, that reminder was worth more than forgiveness. The father rarely went back near the restaurant, but one evening, months later, he walked that way by chance. The new owners had repainted the walls, replaced the sign, changed the menu. Yet the smell of cooking, the sizzle of oil, the rhythm of ladles hitting pots, still carried the same heartbeat. It wasn't bitterness that filled him, it was closure. He stood across the street for a while, hands in his pockets, the sound of city life swirling around him. Somewhere inside, laughter echoed, not cruel laughter this time, but genuine, warm. It made him smile faintly. He thought of how strange it was that the same place that once burned his hands now soothed his heart. Time has a way of turning wounds into wisdom. When he turned to leave, he saw something across the road, his son sitting on the steps of an old cafe, hair unkempt, eyes tired but not angry. Their eyes met, briefly. Neither spoke. There were no apologies, no accusations, just a moment of quiet recognition. Two lives tied by blood and history, finally accepting what had been written between them. The father nodded once, a gesture small but enough. Then he walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The past no longer chased him. From that day on, the story stopped being about pain. It became a memory, one that he carried not as a scar, but as proof that dignity, once reclaimed, can never be taken again. In the weeks that followed, the father received another letter, not from his son this time, but from the new owners of the restaurant. They invited him to visit, to see how well the place was doing, and to thank him for the opportunity. He went one evening, quietly. The staff treated him with respect, offering him a seat near the kitchen. The air smelled of roasted garlic and warmth, the kind of smell that belongs in places built by care, not pride. A young chef, maybe no older than his son once was, approached him and said softly, "This place has your touch. Everyone says so." The old man smiled, lifting his tea slightly in thanks. "Take care of it," he said. "Places like this deserve gentleness." As he left, he felt something lift off him, the last bit of heaviness that had lingered in his chest. Walking home, he realized something beautiful. Revenge had never been his intention. What he had done was correction, a father's last lesson, one not spoken, but shown. His son might never thank him, but one day, when the noise fades and pride grows quiet, maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd remember the feel of his father's hands guiding his, teaching him how to stir, how to season, how to respect the craft. And maybe then he'd know that the same hands he burned had once built everything he ever held dear. That night, the father placed the second letter beside the first. Then he closed the drawer and turned off the light. He slept peacefully, not because he'd won, but because he'd finished what life had asked of him, to teach, even through pain. The fallout was not destruction. It was rebirth, slow, quiet, and inevitable. Because some endings aren't punishment. They're beginnings in disguise. The old man's life after everything felt quieter, not empty, but calm, in the kind of way that makes you notice the smallest sounds again. The clink of a spoon in a cup, the creak of a chair, the whisper of morning wind through half-open curtains. For the first time in decades, he lived without noise, no shouting, no arrogance, no footsteps pacing through a kitchen filled with tension. He had moved out of the city, away from the restaurant, away from reminders. His new home was a small cottage near the edge of a coastal town. It wasn't grand. White walls, one bedroom, a wooden porch that looked over a field where tall grass danced in the wind. But it was his, fully his. No shared names on papers, no arguments over space. Just quiet ownership and freedom. Each morning, he woke before sunrise. He'd open the window, breathe in the scent of salt and wet soil, and listen to the sound of distant waves. He'd make himself a simple breakfast, toast, a boiled egg, tea brewed strong and dark. His hands, once burned and bandaged, had healed completely now, though faint scars remained across his knuckles. Sometimes, as the steam rose from his cup, he'd look at them, not as marks of pain, but as proof that he'd survived what others might not have had the strength to. He didn't think about the restaurant much anymore. When he did, it wasn't with anger or satisfaction. It was simply memory, like a chapter he'd already finished reading. People in the town didn't know who he was. To them, he was just Mr. Hale, the quiet older man who walked to the market every morning and always helped the grocer lift heavy boxes. He liked it that way. Anonymity was a gift he'd earned after a lifetime of being someone else's foundation. On weekends, he visited a small cafe run by a young couple, kind, polite, and respectful. They always greeted him warmly, never letting him pay full price for his coffee. He sat by the window, reading newspapers or watching children run along the street. Sometimes the smell from their kitchen reminded him faintly of the restaurant, not the chaos of it, but the early days when cooking had been a language of love between him and his son. He didn't avoid those memories anymore. They came and went naturally, like waves brushing the shore and retreating again. There was no bitterness left in them, only the understanding that life doesn't always stay kind, but it still gives second chances to those who endure. Every now and then, letters would arrive, some from the lawyer confirming the final settlement of the sale, others from distant relatives who had heard pieces of the story through whispers. A few offered pity, a few offered praise. He answered none of them. His story was not for sympathy or admiration. It was a lesson he had lived, not one he needed to retell. But there was one letter that did make him pause. It came from the new owners of the restaurant, written in neat handwriting. "We hope to honor what you built. Every worker you once trained now teaches others in your way, calm, patient, fair. We thought you should know that your kindness didn't disappear with the sale. It took root here." He read it twice, his throat tightening slightly. It was strange, he thought, how kindness, once crushed under pride, could still find a way to bloom again through someone else. That was enough. In the evenings, he often walked down to the shoreline. The path curved through wild grass and led to a small wooden bench facing the sea. There, he'd sit until sunset painted the waves in orange and gold. Sometimes he'd see fishermen hauling in their nets, children skipping stones, lovers walking hand in hand, life simple and unhurried. He didn't crave company anymore. Loneliness had once been his prison. Now it was his peace. He had everything he needed, a home that was quiet, a bank account that was secure, and a conscience that was clean. The revenge, if anyone called it that, had been done without poison. He hadn't shouted, hadn't destroyed. He had only rebalanced what had gone wrong. There was pride in that, not arrogance, but quiet satisfaction. He had shown that even age can wield strength, not through anger, but through patience and wisdom. And he had done it without becoming cruel himself. Sometimes he thought about his son. He wondered where he was now, whether he'd found work, whether he'd learned anything from the loss. He didn't hope for reconciliation, but neither did he wish him harm. Time had softened even that wound. He simply wished the boy peace, wherever he was. A few months later, while visiting the market, he overheard a conversation between two travelers. They spoke about a man opening a small roadside food stall in another town. The name they mentioned was his son's. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled faintly and continued walking. Maybe the boy had finally learned. Maybe humility had replaced pride. Maybe the lesson had found its purpose after all. Back home, he lit a small lamp near the window and opened his old photo album. The pages smelled of dust and time. There were pictures of his wife, their son as a boy, birthdays, picnics, laughter. He ran his fingers over the photographs, the edges soft from age. He didn't feel sorrow anymore, only gratitude that he had lived enough to see every rise and fall, every betrayal and healing, every beginning and ending that made him who he was. He poured himself a cup of tea and looked out toward the horizon. The sea shimmered under the moonlight. He thought of how life, much like the ocean, always finds balance. Waves that crash always return to calm. In that moment, he realized something simple yet profound. Peace doesn't come when others change. It comes when you stop needing them to. He whispered softly, "This is enough," and smiled. The past had taken much from him, but it had given him one thing no one could ever steal: self-respect. He spent the following months writing small notes in an old journal, reflections, lessons, memories. He didn't plan to publish them or show them to anyone. It was just his way of speaking to time, of recording what pain had taught him. He wrote lines like, "Forgiveness is not letting them back in, it's letting yourself move on. Silence can be sharper than any word. The real wealth in old age is peace, not possessions." Each sentence felt like a sigh, a release of years that had been trapped inside his chest. The locals grew fond of him. Children waved when he walked by. The cafe owners kept his favorite table ready, and the librarian always set aside new books for him to borrow. He wasn't a lonely man anymore. He was a quiet one, and that made all the difference. One morning, as he watched the tide roll in, he thought about how everything he'd done, every step, every decision, had led him here, to this stillness, to this freedom. He didn't need to see his son again to feel closure. He didn't need apologies. He had already received something more powerful, truth. And truth, once faced, heals everything it touches. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, he whispered the final words he'd ever need to say about the life he'd lived. He poured hot soup on my hands to remind me I was weak. But I took back my strength quietly, and now I can hold peace without pain. The waves answered him in rhythm, soft and endless. And for the rest of his days, the old man lived like that, not haunted by what happened, but thankful for what it taught him. He had learned that peace, once earned through patience and pain, is the sweetest revenge of all. Years passed like quiet waves. Seasons shifted, trees aged, and so did he. The old man had found a rhythm that life had long denied him. Peace without noise, purpose without struggle. He spent his mornings reading by the window, afternoons feeding birds that gathered by the stone wall outside his home, and evenings writing in his small leather-bound journal. Every page in that book carried more than memory. It carried wisdom forged in fire, patience, and pain. He didn't write for an audience. He wrote for truth. Truth about love that gives without asking. Truth about betrayal that cuts silently. Truth about dignity, the last possession no one can take. He often reflected on the strange symmetry of life, how the hands that once trembled with burns now turned pages calmly. How the son who once shouted stood somewhere in the same world, learning to be humble again. How time, patient and quiet, becomes the greatest judge of all. He didn't hold bitterness. He'd learned that bitterness is like keeping ashes after the fire, useless, weighty, choking. Forgiveness, on the other hand, didn't mean letting anyone back in. It meant letting peace sit where anger once lived. Some nights, when the moonlight spilled across his floor, he'd look up and speak softly to the silence, as if to his late wife. He'd tell her everything, the pain, the betrayal, the revenge, the peace that followed. He imagined her nodding, smiling faintly, telling him he did what few could. He found justice without losing his soul. He thought often about fathers and sons, how love between them is both the strongest and most fragile bond, built on sacrifice, broken by pride. He understood now that his son's cruelty wasn't born from hate, but weakness, a fear of being small, a hunger for control. And when weak men fear losing power, they hurt the ones who gave it to them. But that was no longer his burden to carry. He remembered one phrase that had carried him through it all, something his own father had once said. Silence is the loudest answer to cruelty. He had lived that truth to the letter. His silence had turned into storms of consequence, not through rage, but through reason. He smiled often now, small smiles, quiet ones, the kind that come from having nothing left to prove. In the town, he became a symbol without meaning to be one. The locals spoke of him with respect, the quiet man who always tipped fairly, helped without boasting, and never spoke ill of anyone. No one knew his story fully, but they sensed the gravity behind his calm. Children greeted him. The baker saved him the freshest loaf. The postman lingered longer just to chat. He had become part of the gentle fabric of life. Every month, he visited the sea. It became his confession place. He'd sit for hours, watching waves collapse and rise again. He'd think of how people are like that too, broken by their mistakes, but still capable of rising again if they learn. He often wondered if his son ever found forgiveness for himself. He hoped he did, not because he wanted to be close again, but because he knew that guilt, if left unhealed, can rot a man's soul from within. Once, years later, he received a small package. No name, just an address written in rough ink. Inside was a framed photograph of his old restaurant, the one his son had once run. It looked different now, painted in warm tones, clean, lively, and at the corner of the photo, a note. "It's doing well. The young man who runs it says he learned everything from a chef who taught with patience, not pride." The old man chuckled softly. Life had a way of circling back, didn't it? He placed the photo on his shelf, not as a memory of pain, but as proof that good roots, even when burned, can grow again. He had learned that revenge fades, but lessons endure, that love can survive distance, that justice, when done quietly, can ripple for years. As he aged, his steps grew slower, his breath shorter, but his heart lighter. He had nothing left to carry except peace, and that was enough. In his final entries, he wrote a few simple lines, ones that would outlive him, because truth always does. "He poured hot soup on my hands to humiliate me, but I used those same hands to rebuild myself. He thought power came from shouting. I showed him it comes from knowing when to stay silent. In the end, I did not punish him. I simply stopped protecting him from the truth." He signed the last page with a trembling hand and closed the book. Years later, when he passed, the people of the town remembered him not for his story, but for his peace. They said he lived with quiet grace. They said he smiled like someone who had forgiven the world. They said his house always smelled like tea and calm mornings. And maybe, somewhere far away, his son heard the news and sat in silence, not in guilt, but in understanding. Maybe he whispered his father's name and finally realized that love, once lost, can't always be reclaimed. But it can be honored by living better. The old man's story didn't end with revenge. It ended with balance, and that was the greatest justice of all. "He burned my hands," the man had once said, "but time healed them and taught me how to hold peace instead of pain." The waves rolled on, the world moved forward, and his legacy, quiet, calm, unbreakable, lived not in the ashes of what was destroyed, but in the dignity of what he restored.